Welcome to the Sheth Leadership Academy Lecture Series, a series of lectures delivered by Professor Jagdish Sheth, one of the top thinkers in consumer behavior and globalization, and the author of books such as Firms of Endearment and The Self-Destructive Habits of Good Companies. This lecture is part 2 of how industries are born, grow, and revitalize, efficiency versus growth.
The industry goes through that cycle of constantly struggling to balance efficiency and growth. As I mentioned, in the early stages of the industry's evolution, it's growing very fast, but it's not efficient. So anything that provides a scale, it says economies of scale, but not production. Surprisingly, the biggest economies of scale is procurement. Then it begins to diversify and grow through diversification, and ultimately it becomes a stable industry. When the stability arises, contrary to typical things, industry is not either or monopolistic competition. Industry is both always. In other words, industry is a constant balancing between monopolistic competitions. You have a high rent that you collect or margin driven. You have sub-monopolies, lots of little guys out there doing differentiated things, to having a scale and creating an oligopoly. Oligopoly becomes one-stop shop, etc. When the industry is highly oligopolistic, it begins to break up into monopolistic competition. We don't know of the two and when it happens, but industry at a stage of maturity is always like a shopping mall. Shopping mall to me is the reflection of all industries. In a shopping mall, we are anchor stores, which are full-line, volume-driven generalists. They don't discriminate any customers, they don't discriminate. Everything is possible so long as it is profitable. This is a volume-driven business. And you see in between those three anchor full-line specialty retailers who are predominantly margin-driven. So you see the existence of monopolistic competition, which are those little guys with differentiated products and services, charging higher. Same place in the same market as people who are selling on a strictly volume. Shopping center would have Sears, JCPenney, Ward. Now it's Macy's, and they are there in the same shopping mall, coexisting with specialty retailers, like, for example, a product specialty, Foot Locker, and a market specialty would be a Benetton, fancy designer clothing. Fashion design. That's a typical pattern, as you can see in the center of this food shopping center. So you see a product specialty and a market specialty, and sometimes you have a super niche with not just a product market but product market combination, very unique. You have certain merch meant for a certain target segment, level of excellence or exclusivity that you don't see anything else. This is directly reflected in margin versus volume positioning. The industry is constantly a balance of margin-driven players and volume-driven players. When you plot that market share versus market value, which may be a price-earnings ratio, which may be a Tobin's Q, which is book value versus market value, which may have some speculative value. You see on the left side are all the niche, that's specialty. And super niche will have more margin than niche. The slope is very sharp. That's that a super niche, while it is very good in margin, wants to grow through IPO or however they do it. Venture capitalists will invest, and therefore you want to grow. The silicon companies are doing right now in social media, in sharing economy, etc., that we talked about. And surprisingly, too fast a growth, the slope is sharp, you go in the ditch. On the right side are volume-driven players, and there is only room for 3, not 4, not 5. And the industry, unless it reaches, be constantly trying non-organic growth by mergers, acquisitions. This is a very important chart, and one that has become very valuable looking at the industry structure, and it's called the rule of 3. The rule of 3 has some very key predictive propositions. Through competitive forces, you see the architecture of oligopoly, part monopoly competition. The three full-line generalists usually contribute to 90% of the capacity and the market. The balance is all so many niche players, and no numerical thing that I have found through empirical research as to how many niche players. We don't know that thing. Number one company usually has 40% market share when the industry truly matures. Number two company 20%, number three 10%. And if the number one company not have 40%, there is a room for mergers, acquisitions, and it's very possible that number two, number three, 4, and 5 can gather and become number one. That's very important to understand the number one unless you have reached at least 40% of the total market. The interesting area is that if they do not concentrate to the level of three companies, 7 to 90%, there is always an opportunity for inorganic growth or acquisitions. I wanted to point out that company is most innovative in every industry I have analyzed, not number one, number two. Number one, number two may have the largest R&D dollars, etc. They probably have more inventions patented, but they don't commercialize for internal resistance, internal inertia. Usually capital dollars are stuck with the older technology, whatever the reasons. Number three company is highly innovative. It changes the paradigm. So RC Cola, not Cola or Pepsi Cola, putting in a can, coming out with diet drink. It was not AT&T in long distance business, but Print, who came out with a 10-cent pricing universally, using a television actress as a spokesperson, just went on. Every kind of innovation in the industry. GM or Ford or Chrysler always led revolutions in making automobiles. It had the best R&D center of what they came out with the thinking. And therefore, if there is a competition prior between number one and number two company during an industry not growing, like beer industry in 80s or the cola industries in the late 80s, etc., or in automobile industry after the first energy crisis, when the fight for share arises between number one and number two, guess what? Number three goes in the ditch. Very interesting proposition. So these are very remarkable findings that have come, 150 different products and services that my colleague and I have, and we have a book called The Rule of, which has become the platform for investment bankers, consultants, as well as platform for teaching in the classrooms. Now that is about market share, market penetration, full line generalist as a way of expanding the industry. The way, of course, is going global or international, increasing the scope. So scope comes by adding more product lines. Scope comes by adding more this. So once from, if the industry is organized locally, local to national groups. Many universities and colleges are all local. Banks used to be local in America. They're becoming like regional rule of three, eventually national rule of three. Mobile services used to be local at one time. They are now not only global, but global. Or you go from national to region, especially when regional economies are created like European, where there is no just independent of the German market, independent of the Italian market, one free market, and there's a rationalization and a rule of three comes at a regional level. The most fascinating, of course, is from regional going to global. PC industry is already global now. It's basically three large players dominating, as we know, probably in the future. Today, number one is Lenovo. Out of nowhere, Acer may become number two. We have the HP, the Dell, IBM, the business in the PC making business, for example, two Lenovo. You see the same global consumer electronics, whether those are television sets, obviously absent as a television maker even. We exited way back in the early 80s, the whole television industry, because we thought we cannot compete against the Japanese. Japanese cannot compete against, who will not be able to compete with the Chinese. And IT infrastructure makers are the same way. We feel that is truly a global architecture. So if you go to the next, called the global rule of three. Traditionally, rule of three will be true like mall analog, US market. Three big players, lots of niche players. Japan, three big players, lots of niche. Japan used to be second largest economy. Europe, primarily Western European countries, three big players, one German, one French, one Italian, one Dutch, whatever turns out to be. And therefore, ultimately, when the industry is global, it rationalizes. There is no room for 9 players. They are free. Do you see enormous globalization and global acquisitions, exit strategies? Steel industry evolved like that, for example. Carbon black is evolving like that right now. Aluminum is like that. Cellular telephone industry is going to go through the same architecture. In the old days, in car making, we had the Goodyear, Firestone, Goodrich. Japan only had Bridgestone at that time. Now they have a Toyo and Yokohama. The Europeans had Michelin, for example, Pirelli and Dunlop. When the industry globalizes and all 3 markets are done by one player, it becomes rule of 3 where each country one survives. So Michelin now survives. So does Bridgestone. Very interesting. Usually number 3 company globalization is the first casualty, because you are fighting with a new entrant and becomes too intense, so number 3 company collapses, out of business. BF Goodrich went out of business. There was no second, third player at that time in Japan, so nothing happened there. And you now see the rule of 3 on a global basis. And in the automobile industry, where Toyota has become globally number 1, number 2, and in fact Volkswagen temporarily was number 1, but with the recent problem with its fuel efficiency standards and the cheating sliding back, but hopefully. Number 3 race is going on between Ford, General Motors, Fiat, which owns car, etc. We don't know. We are looking at the future of companies like Honda and BMW in the process. We have no what's going to happen, but acquisitions are inevitable in this industry. Similarly, I've seen in aircraft manufacturing, we used to have Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, and Lockheed. Lockheed collapsed. McDonnell Douglas got together. Airbus competition came from Europe. There is a 3 player, and the forecast is that it will come probably from China now. So Boeing, Airbus, Chinese manufacturer. In the airlines, because they are government owned and operated, open skies are not everywhere, as deregulation is open skies, as they call it. As is being more and more deregulated, government owned airlines are being privatized or divested, and you see what they are doing is creating airlines like Star Alliance, which is a to help each other, but also create operational efficiency by code sharing, etc. And you see 3 big alliances: Star Alliance, One World, and SkyTeam. To me, this organizational principle is very important, anchored to efficiency and growth. Growth coming from not only market share concentration, but through scope diversification into products, markets. The scope diversification making the full line generalist, as we see in example, as we see in fact in education for a matter. We can see in of industries how a niche company is broadening out by having more and more products or services offering. It will happen to all the Silicon Valley companies. It is happening to Google, for example. It is happening to Microsoft, everybody. Then the industry gets organized as a full line general, which is an oligopolistic structure and monopolist. Post global rationalization take place. I don't know what happens to niche companies when it globalizes. It might go niche globally, that's possible. Or it might basically, remain a super niche company. Here now the revitalization phase. It is organized, it's to go beyond scope. In the academic world, we have never taught any scale and scope. So I've added this module about how does an industry get once it has achieved the scale efficiency and scope capabilities. My view is that mature industries don't die, they get redefined. As I'm here, soft drinks become beverages, television becomes entertainment, railroads become transportation. Now it allows more thinking about products and services, more about markets where to go. Whole theory of inevitability of birth and death, I don't agree that either. Watch industry should have died, coming back in an interesting way. I did a lot of research on coffee, and at one time we predicted coffee will just decline for general foods. There will be no more coffee market. Suddenly you see Starbucks completely revised, but redefining the industry, drinking coffee at home, drinking coffee in a cafe. or takeout. But the coffee industry back again. This happening with the oil industry, with all the alternate energies coming, oil industry will get refined. It would be steel industry, as would be any industrial commodities. The third reason why revitalization takes place is that there is a theory of vacating market, which primarily means that a given economy gives up market deliberately, intentionally, does not fight. We gave up many mature products to someone else, like our television industry and steel industry for that matter. I can give you hundreds of examples. Japan has surrendered Koreans. Have you seen that? Any industry the Japanese was dominant, Koreans have taken over. Microwave ovens invented. We outsourced to the Japanese. Eventually it went to Koreans. Today it's all Chinese. So Korea to China is an interesting option. Desire of innovation to revitalize, especially process, is as much within an industry as it is without. It comes from outside, probably is true limited to product innovation, but the process change is more internal within the industry, and industry gets revitalized as we have gone through. For example, the process change in airlines, where from order booking to advance payment, the online boarding, everything is done, whether they have changed, or art industry is the same. So what are the enablers of revitalization? How does an industry get reborn, redefined? And I find 4 drivers that are key enablers. The first driver, of course, is substitute technology. They may be discontinuous or disruptive, or there may be improvements. Our HD TV has totally revitalized television. Television will die with the PCs coming in, small screen coming in, but today televisions are thriving quite well. Smartphones, voice phone became smartphones. Industry is growing again. Internet, mobile internet, growing again in a big way. So substitute technology is one factor. Changing demographics, where demographics like age population, working women house, dual income earning households, increasing ethnic diversity worldwide, cultural diversity in a market, decline of the middle class among all advanced countries, or the rise of the emerging markets, whatever the trends are, the demographics are very key drivers of change, and therefore enablers to revitalize if the industry does its research and listens to market signals. We have seen the revitalization of the traditional commodity businesses, which is grocery businesses, through health food. People are paying a lot of money for health, as opposed to Coca-Cola per se. They are drinking water, they are drinking natural juices, just goes on. Salsa, with a more demographic diversity, where we have Hispanic population, a peripheral becomes the core essentially, where the majority adopts the minority behavior all the time. We are more and more luxury products are limited to luxury buyers. It is to masses. So masses accept luxury products, as we have done wine, for example, as I have done fashion business, just goes on and on. So luxury masses revitalizes the industry. Biggest change often happens through regulation. Smart market effort, how to use the government to bring about. And for example, economies are not growing. After the first energy crisis in the 80s, we began to figure out as makers that trade may create growth. So you either create free trade agreements like the NAFTA, the European Union, or you have bilateral free trade agreements between 2 nations like Chile and America, for example, or the islands and America, where one country buyers and sellers to each other. What the advanced countries, the emerging markets, don't have it, that's it. And what the defense, agricultural products and raw materials, industrial, advanced countries don't have it, etc. So that becomes very true. TO that was formed in additional redefining the industry. Mandatory talked about. You make it mandatory by law, and therefore market is created, very redefined. So whatever technologies, you make it mandatory, like universal internet right now, for example. And we've gone through healthcare reforms, which is redefining the whole healthcare industry, which when you put all pieces together, healthcare delivery, healthcare equipment, the as well as in fact pharmaceutical, just crossed $2 trillion. All players in those industries by product category are redefining themselves as to what business we should be in, and in the process. The last one is emerging markets. Those are the new growth engines. The rise of the new brand concepts in countries like China, India, Africa, anywhere, wherever there are emerging economies, is mind-boggling change. Consumption that is all unbranded, served by unregulated markets, is now becoming branded and organized. And that revitalizes industry to participate into those. And most companies may be the advanced country companies going markets, such as the Unilever, the Nestle Corporation, Procter & Gamble, or whoever they are, in packaged goods industries, true in appliances industry, true in everything else that we know. Now, in India, Africa, there's a whole base of the pyramid market, people who earn less than, it is about a $5 trillion industry, unorganized, unbranded. How do you make it more legitimate in many ways? From lending to homemade products to whatever we can think about. And this is the key area for growth, education, and healthcare, namely the emerging economies. So I have ideas to revitalize, redefine an industry, substitute technology, changing demographics, regulation change, and emerging economies. So let me just stop here and summarize. Industries get created not just by innovation and entrepreneurship, but there are many which actually create brand new industry. I talk new areas, or based upon my research, there are 10 ways a new industry can be organized or created, starting with such things as automatic manual, or primarily removing the friction between the buyer and seller, between a producer and a consumer, or in fact taking care of the need, which is more affordability plus, or once become needs, it creates a brand industry, to government creating industries, to Eureka, and those were I identified. That's how industries are born. How do industries get organized? There are theories about organization by historians like Alfred Chandler, which is an alignment of strategy with structure. There are theories about how industries can organize shakeouts, mergers, but mine says that ultimate reason for industry organization is neither strategy nor structure, it is just access to capital. Smart entrepreneurs really know where the money is, not technology is, or customers are, which is mind-boggling thinking. It's really what happens. So that I think is a very key to understand the capital laws and how capitalists really make markets, organize the markets. As venture capitalists, private equity players like Blackstone, Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company, or Temasek in Singapore as a sovereign fund, just goes on. So whoever has the private equity capital as an investment, this was done by kings, wealthy people. They supported the expeditions, discovering things. Entrepreneurs, because he knew how to raise capital. Rockefellers were great entrepreneurs. They knew how to get the capital. A great market maker because he knew how to, as a banker, give the industries and create industries in many ways. So capital is a very key aspect in the industry. Once the industry is organized, it is growing very well. It needs scale and efficiency, and that comes through scale through public policy, government mandate, de facto standards, or shakeout and mergers. Now the industry is looking for growth. How do I grow? It starts penetrating the product market domination. So industry begins to diversify. Diversify by adding more product lines and creates one-stop shop, full-line generalists. Oh, I just don't offer insurance, but I offer life, property insurance. I don't offer insurance just for the automobile. I offer insurance now for the motors, for the boat, for anything that's an asset value. That's a full-line generalist. And then you begin to go global. So you have a scale through organization, standards, governance, and now you have a scope which is diversifying the portfolio. Finally, the industry matures, and that always looks like a shopping, and the shopping mall are very important because in a typical shopping mall you see full line general is 3 anchor stores, lots of niche players. Full line general compete on value, price, quality. The niche companies compete against exclusivity. The industry stays like that. Lack of growth now, industry is very efficient but not growing. So it struggles for growth and the industry gets revitalized. And as I mentioned, there are 4 forces of revitalization: substitute technology, changing demographics, rise of markets, and government, regulation, deregulation, policy. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture. It's a little longer one, but I think it has a lot of insightful findings which are not traditional thinking, but hopefully something that is going to question a prevailing wisdom about how industries and reorganize. Industries are born and they're reborn.
Thanks for listening to part 2 of Grow and Revitalize, Efficiency versus Growth. For more about Professor Sheth, visit www.shethleadershipacademy.com.